Kia ora everyone, Kiwi Modeler here, and in today's video I'm going to be building this Airfix's 1/72 scale Douglas TBD-1 Devastator. So let's get started. To begin assembly of the kit, I began with the cockpit, as per usual for pretty much every single other model aircraft kit known to man. Cockpit assembly is fairly simple. There were not many parts, as this is quite an old kit. Just this back board here, which I'm struggling to put in, then two seats and two control columns, though I would later remove the control column in the middle. After looking at some reference photos, I found out that the guy in the middle would not have a control column, and then also a small circular piece, which I'm not quite sure what's for, on the raised part at the rear. Right, the last couple of assemblies for the cockpit, starting off with the gunner's position, and again, quite simple, just a seat, this little backboard, and then I also have to glue in the control panel and this little bucket thing for to rest the gun in. Right, and now it's time to paint the cockpit. The colour of paint that I'm using is Vallejo's US Light Green, which is my usual cockpit colour choice for American aircraft. I also use this colour on the insides of the fuselage as well, and also in the landing gear bays. Now it's time for some brush work. I am using some of Tamiya's XF1 flat black to brush paint the control panel and also the anti-glare panel just above the control panel, and also the radio operators section. So, as I've already said, this is quite an old kit. This is a 1969 tooling of the Devastator, so of course you're not going to get any photo etched seatbelts or even decal seatbelts in it. So, as per my usual technique, whenever I face a problem like this, I cut out a few strips of masking tape to what I think is the right size. I do most of the time use reference photos for this, and then basically put the masking tape in the area where the seatbelts look good. So that's what I am doing here. You also might notice that I've done some minor chipping in the cockpit as well, simply just using Vallejo's aluminum colour. I can now begin to paint the belts. I am using Tamiya's XF92 and then Vallejo's flat aluminum for the buckles. Here I'm using a light grey wash to pick out some of the details, especially on the darker surfaces, and then I can glue the cockpit parts into the side of the fuselage, which I have also given a slight light grey wash. I can now glue the two fuselage halves together. Next I can begin gluing the two halves of the wings together. The wings come in two main sections, as you get the option to have the wings folded or lowered. I opted to go for the lowered position. Unfortunately, as I said, this is quite an old kit. It means I had to use a lot of filler as I dry fitted the two halves of the wings together. And yeah, it was quite a large gap, so I decided, instead of putting the filler on afterwards, after I'd glued the wings together, as that might ruin the corrugated effect on the wings, I opted to put the filler on first, then the wings and on. I did the same when attaching the wings onto the fuselage. Next I began to paint the engine. I'm using Vallejo aluminum here, and then I would go on to paint, I'm not quite sure what it's called, but like the lump in the middle of the engine, I suppose. I painted that with Vallejo neutral grey. Then I also painted what I believe is the ignition ring using Tamiya's copper. I don't know if that is the ignition ring. Feel free to correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. But yeah, so I painted that copper, just had a little bit of visual interest. And then I glued the two parts of the engine together and glued that into the engine cowling. I also gave it a quick dark wash as well, just to accentuate those details, because there are actually some pretty nice details in the engine. Next I glued the engine onto the fuselage. as well as the horizontal stabilizers. You'll notice that the tail fin is masked, and that's because I forgot to press the record button whenever painting it, but the markings that I'm going for on this particular Devastator have a quite nice, actually, white and red stripy tail, so you'll see that at the end whenever I demask it. Here I'm gluing in the siren for the Devastator, because apparently the Devastator actually had a siren, a bit like the Stuka. And then after that I am gluing in the 30 caliber machine gun in the lowered position. And the final step before painting, gluing in the canopy. Now the canopy comes in 4 segments, this rear piece here, a larger piece in the middle, and then the front 2 sections. And I found actually that these parts were quite warped and just did not want to fit in properly, so I eventually did manage to get them sort of straight, but I could do better. And though, again, this is quite an old kit. Right, and now it's time to start painting. So to begin, I am using Vallejo's neutral grey for the underside, and then I am masking off the folding parts of the wings, and I am using Vallejo's intermediate blue, as for some reason the folding parts of the wings were painted completely blue, I guess as camouflage whenever the wings are folded. I then painted the upper surface of the Devastator with the same intermediate blue, and there you can see the quite badly put on canopy, but don't worry, I will adjust it later on. And here is the grand reveal. You can now see those lovely red and white stripes on the tail. I was actually very surprised and pleased with the result. I did not expect them to come out that good. But anyway, in typical fashion, I completely forgot to press the record button the entire way through post-shading the model, or highlighting it basically. But I basically just used Vallejo faded blue and sprayed it over the large surface areas like the wings, the horizontal stabilizer, and the tops of the fuselage. I also sprayed it in a slightly heavier coat over the ailerons and the horizontal stabilizers, meaning the bit that would be made out of canvas, to sort of give that it's not made out of metal really. To prepare for weathering and decals, I sprayed the entire model with a gloss coat. Whenever it comes to placing down the decals, I first soaked the area where I wanted to put the decal down with Humbrol Decal Fix. Then I placed the decal down and put another layer of Humbrol Decal Fix over it. There weren't that many decals on the particular scheme I was going for. The kit gives you 2 markings, one for a pre-war scheme with a bare metal fuselage, yellow wings, and a red tail, or a Battle of Midway scheme which has the same sort of camouflage here. I opted to go for the Battle of Coral Sea, which still uses the red dots in the US insignias. So I used some of the decals provided in the kit for the pre-war Devastator. Obviously I painted on the tail because I couldn't get a decal for that. And then I have a decal sheet which is for US Navy and Marine aircraft in 1/72 scale. So I used a few of the decals from those to create the specific scheme I was going for. Here I'm using one of the decals provided in the kit for the Battle of Midway scheme, though as you can see I used a red dot from the decal sheet that I was just talking about. The decal sheet that I used, the decals in it are incredibly thin, and I actually had to go through quite a few red dots before I managed to get them on properly, as they seem to have a habit of wanting to fold over on themselves, and I had to swap them out a few times, but eventually they went on well. But there is a noticeable difference in coloration between the red dot on the wings and the red dot on the fuselage, but it doesn't really matter, it still looks quite good. Here I am spraying the model with a matte coat to seal in the decals and prepare for the weathering. So to begin the weathering, I decided to do a little bit of minor chipping, at least it was meant to be minor chipping. I quite struggled doing chipping, but I tried to do quite minor chipping, but I often overdo it, and it was definitely the same in this case. But I've been trying out different chipping techniques, and at the moment I'm using one that I found to be quite successful, using a fine paintbrush and dry brushing on an aluminum colour onto the areas that I want to have the paint scratched away. And as you can see here, those who know military aircraft markings, you'll know that I've made quite a major mistake here, and I have not painted on the walkway stripes, but don't worry, I will realise that mistake later on and fix it before it's too late. And as you can see, I realised my mistake and quickly masked off the areas where the walkway stripes are going to be painted, and painted them with Tamiya's rubber black. Here I am removing the masks that I had put into the landing gear bays, and I am gluing in the landing gear. I found the landing gear to be quite flimsy at first, but eventually I managed to get a good stick to it, and it was pretty solid actually in the end. Here's something that I was very nervous about doing: spray painting the exhaust stains. I had to do quite a bit of research on what the exhaust stains look like, and unfortunately there weren't many reference photos of exhaust stains, but of the few that I could find, they seemed to be going upwards like I'm painting here. I haven't had good experience with painting exhaust stains with an airbrush before, but I'm actually really impressed with how these have turned out. The final step of weathering was to give the whole thing a dark wash to pick out all those lovely details, which surprisingly there are actually quite a few nice details, especially with the corrugated wings and the rivets. I coated the whole aircraft just with a plain old dark wash, and then finally sealed it in with a matte coat. And that's pretty much all the weathering I did on this model. It was early 1942, so obviously not a lot of combat, so I probably did over weather it a bit, but still, I'm happy with the result. Finally, I glued the propeller on, and with that, I call this build of Airfix's 1/72 scale Douglas TBD-1 Devastator complete. So here's a little bit of information about the TBD Devastator. It was in service with the US Navy from 1937 to 1942, and it was a torpedo bomber. By the time it saw combat service, it was already starting to show its age, though. For example, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, 22 Devastators were launched, and 10 were shot down, with no Japanese ships being sunk. At the Battle of Midway, results were even worse, with a 4-to-1 kill rate against the 0. Douglas Devastator was eventually retired from service in 1942, soon to be replaced by the very famous TBF Avenger, which also first saw service at the Battle of Midway. Now, the markings that I've done my kit in were of a TBD-1 Devastator, flown by Lieutenant Captain James Brett of VT-2 USS Lexington at the Battle of the Coral Sea. But there's a little bit of information about the Devastator. Now, how's the kit itself? So, the kit was alright. Obviously, it's 1969 tooling. The actual kit that I got was the 2008 release, which I am pretty sure was the last release of the Devastator by Airfix. Now, it is obviously showing its age, of course, since 1969, quite a while ago. And I did have to obviously fill in quite a few seams, especially around the wings. But if you do manage to pick one of these up, it is an alright kit if you have patience, especially with the canopy. So I would recommend heating up the canopy maybe to sort of reshape it if your canopy's warped or something. I didn't have loads and loads of problems with the canopy, except just a slight misalignment, which I managed to eventually correct. But also, if it's not a very common aircraft in 1/72 scale, Devastator, so that's another thing too, rarity. Though apparently, Hobby Boss is releasing 2 Devastators in 1/72 scale this year, which I am very much looking forward to. They'll be releasing your normal average TBD-1, which is the one I've just built here, of course, and also releasing a version of the Devastator with floats. I can't remember what specific designation it's called, but that is a kit I am looking forward to a lot. So as soon as Hobby Boss release it, I will definitely be doing an unboxing and build on it. But anyway, that's pretty much the whole video all done. So I'll wrap it up here. I'm the Kiwi Modeler, and I'll see you next time.